Hello, ladies and gentlemen. As it has already been indicated, my name is Norbert Slenzok, and I'm going to be a moderator of the next panel, the first panel session during our conference, entitled Ludwig von Mises and Ethics. The last book, written by Ludwig von Mises, the ultimate foundation of economic science, begins with the following statement. This essay is not a contribution to philosophy. However, as we all know, in Mises' writings there are plenty of interesting philosophical insights. However, as we also all know, most of them, or at least the most profound, most influential of them, deal with the problems of epistemology and the methodology of social sciences, of course with special regard to economics. That said, we must remember that Mises was not only an academic, not only a pure theorist, but also an ardent advocate of classical liberalism and laissez-faire free market, and thus he saw a philosophical and ethical justification for his political agenda, and this is exactly the topic of our panel, which is going to be further elaborated by our magnificent speakers. First, Professor Dariusz Juruś, philosopher from Jagiellonian University. Please, Professor, come to us. Dr. Jakub Bożydar Wiśniewski, also philosopher and economist. And Father Jacek Gniadek, a missionary and moral theologist, please. All the speakers are authors of the numerous articles, papers, and books on libertarianism and Austrian economics. I guess that their speeches will be very helpful when it comes down to understanding Mises' philosophical legacy. And as for the rules of our debate, as far as I know, we have 70 minutes at our disposal. So we are going to start with 3 10-minute speeches, then we're gonna have 10 minutes responses, and at the end there will be time for you, time for questions from the audience. And we are going to start with Professor Juruś.
And thank you very much for the invitation for this conference and this anniversary. And I'm going to talk about, firstly, about meta-ethical positions of Mises. Why? Because, first of all, I think that is less known, this meta-ethical position of Mises. And the secondly, which is also very important, I think, it's a more controversial, according to me, at least. So before I start to present Mises' position as regards meta-ethical questions, I will make a short introduction as regards meta-ethics. So when we speak about meta-ethics, we speak generally about analytical ethics or about the language of ethics. So when we speak about meta-ethics, we can have 2 general positions in meta-ethics. The first position is called cognitivism, and the second one is called non-cognitivism. So what are the differences between cognitivism and non-cognitivism? So there are fundamental differences between cognitivists and non-cognitivists. So the first difference is that cognitivists claim that there is something as objective reality to which ethical judgments refer. So ethical judgments, in a sense, are descriptive because they describe something, and therefore ethical judgments can be true or false. So there is distinction between two positions in cognitivism, namely between so-called intuitionists and naturalists. What do intuitionists claim? They claim that there is a feature which is described by ethical judgments, and this feature is non-natural. There is no natural feature which is described when somebody utters ethical judgments. And that non-natural feature is apprehended, according to intuitionists, by intuition, but something which by other people are called something mystical. What do naturalists claim? They agree with intuitionists that there is, in fact, particular feature which is described by ethical judgments, but they don't agree with intuitionists as regard the nature of this feature, and they claim that that feature is natural feature. So in other words, we can, in a hand, apprehend this feature using scientific methods, psychology, anthropology, or sociology. So there is a difference between intuitionists and naturalists. In opposition to cognitivists, there are non-cognitivists. What do they claim? They claim that there is no such a thing as objective reality to which ethical terms, ethical judgments refer to. So it means that the meaning of ethical terms or ethical judgments is only expressive meaning. So the only role of ethical terms, only function of ethical terms and judgments, or the only meanings or the main meaning of ethical judgments is expressive meaning, or evocative meaning. Therefore, there is a further conclusion. There is no such a thing in ethics as true or falsity. Because when we speak about our expressions, we cannot say that our expressions are true or false. When I am shouting hurrah, I express myself, and I cannot say that it was something true or false. So there is a fundamental difference between cognitivist and non-cognitivism. And for example, to give an example as a function of these two positions, when I am saying that man is a good person, according to intuitionists, I am describing non-natural feature of that person which I comprehend by intuition. According to naturalists, when I say that that man is a good person, I'm also describing a feature of that man, but which is natural. In a sense, I can know what is this particular feature using methods of sociology, psychology, anthropology, and so on. But when I'm saying that is a good person, when I am a motivist, I'm only express my attitudes toward that person. In that case, positive attitude toward this person. So therefore, I cannot say that my utterance was true or false. So where is Mises in this spectrum? So Mises is on the non-cognitivist part. I will quote a fragment from Mises when he clearly declares this position. Propositions asserting existence, affirmative existential propositions, or non-existence, negative existential propositions are descriptive. they assert something about the state of the whole universe or parts of the universe. With regard to them, questions of truth and falsity are significant. They must not be confounded with judgments of value. Judgments of value are voluntaristic. They express feelings, tastes, or preferences of the individual who utters them. With regard to them, there cannot be any questions of truth and falsity. They are ultimate and not subject to any proof or evidence. So, what is the consequence of such a standpoint of Mises? The first consequence is that all ethical judgments, all value judgments are personal and subjective, as Mises says. Personal and subjective. And the other consequence is that there is no objective standard or criterion according to which we can assess whether particular judgment was true or false. So we cannot assess as regards the value judgments which concerns ultimate ends. We can, of course, as perhaps my colleagues will be talking about, we can assess only means or measures to particular ends. And what is the last consequences of that Mises standpoint? That if there is no truth and falsity as regards the realm of ethics, there is a split between the realm of facts and realm of values. So there is no transition, according to Mises, from the factual judgments to value judgments. So in other words, we cannot derive any value judgments from any factual judgments. So it is very important to say that, because when we go further into consequences of Mises' position, we can say that actually it is not possible to argue in ethics, because if there is no truth or falsity when we speak about value judgment, there is no point to discuss, to argue, to persuade people as regards ethics. So that's my first part of my speech. Thank you very much, and I take the floor to other colleagues.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Wiśniewski, the microphone is yours.
Okay, so the main thesis that I would like to put forward is that the main contribution of Mises to sound ethical reflection, even if it is only an implicit, not an explicit suggestion, is that value freedom does not imply value irrelevance. So what do we mean by that? Of course, Mises is known to be an adamant supporter of value freedom. He has been an intransigent defender of the notion that economics is a value-free science, a value-free scholarly discipline, which means that it is not necessarily implicated in any specific ethical system. And of course, Mises was so adamant about stressing the value freedom of economics, primarily in order to combat Marxism, which suggested that economics is essentially, or so-called classical economics, or neoclassical economics, or Austrian economics, because all of those, shall we say, classical and classically inspired strands of economics were understood by Marxists to be an expression of interests, political interests of a specific social group. And Mises was adamant in denying that notion. He insisted that economics has a very strict logical structure, that economics is essentially an application of logic to the analysis of human action, in order to refute the notion that, as I said, that accepting certain economic propositions necessarily implies that we are committed to certain value judgments. he said, no, economics applies to every social group, every society, every environment in which human action takes place. So it is definitely not the case that economics is, or for instance, Austrian economics, the kind of economics that, the kind of tradition that Mises belongs to, is a tradition which serves as a kind of underhanded endorsement of the interests of capitalists or entrepreneurs or property owners and so on. And this insistence on the logical necessity of economic theorems and on the logically deductive structure of economic reasoning was his primary tool of arguing for that conclusion. So that's what Mises meant by value freedom. And I said at the outset that value freedom does not imply value irrelevance. In other words, even though economics is value free, even though by doing economics we are not committed to making any ethical judgments or ethical statements, it nonetheless does not imply that economics is unimportant or uninteresting or irrelevant to economic reasoning. And of course, as has been mentioned, as my colleague mentioned a moment ago, Mises himself was an ethical subjectivist. So he didn't think that there is any parallel logical objective structure to be discovered in ethics, similar to the one that he insisted can be discovered in economics. But fortunately, we do not have to agree with Mises in order to find economics, especially in the Austrian tradition, as a discipline which is very important in the context of doing sound ethical theory. So it is precisely due to the fact that economics is value-free that, I would argue, it is applicable to all kinds of ethical traditions and, in an important sense, circumscribes those ethical traditions. It makes us realize that there are certain non-negotiable constraints and parameters, logically necessary constraints, that have to be taken into account whenever we propose certain ethical goals. Whenever we say that certain things are desirable, we have to take into account whether those supposedly desirable goals are viable, whether they are achievable. And it is precisely by studying economics that we can find out whether such goals are achievable or not. And this applies to all ethical traditions, all across the board. So, for example, if we are utilitarians, but utilitarians of a more thick, let us say, or of a more materialistic variety than the utilitarianism of Mises, and we suggest, for example, that it is ethically it is an ethically laudable and desirable goal to maximize the physical productivity of the economy, we have to bear in mind that in order to be able to implement those ethical goals, we have to have a sound and comprehensive knowledge of economics, because otherwise our efforts to do something that we consider to be ethically desirable from the utilitarian standpoint, for example, in this context, will be counter-effective. It is precisely by studying economics that we can understand, that we can comprehend the fact that there are certain necessary logical and praxeological and institutional preconditions that have to be met if the physical productivity of the economy is to be maximized. So, for example, what we need in order to obtain this kind of maximization is specialization, division of labor, capital accumulation, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And those phenomena, in turn, require a certain degree of respect for the institutions of private property, private property exchange, sound money, legal stability, and so on and so forth. So in this sense, economics is very relevant to ethical considerations. Or, to take another example, let us assume that we are not utilitarians, but deontologists of a certain kind, socialist deontologists, for example. And we believe that it is a duty of every right-thinking individual to contribute to the creation of a functional socialist economy, because only a socialist economy can fulfill the noble ethical objective of taking from everyone according to his abilities and giving to everyone according to his needs. And again, our ethical reasoning will be futile or worse if we do not take economics into consideration. The most fundamental principle of every sound deontology says that ought implies can. In other words, if we believe that something should be done, if we believe that something ought to be done, then we have to make sure that it can in fact be done, that it is logically possible to do it. And again, if we apply the Misesian theorem of the impossibility of economic calculation under socialism to this particular kind of ethical reasoning, then we can come to the conclusion that it cannot be a duty of anyone to try to implement a well-functioning socialist economy, because there is no such thing. There can be no such thing as a rationally functioning socialist economy. That there are praxeological necessary reasons why such an institutional structure is bound to frustrate any attempts at maximizing social utility or maximizing, let us say, ethical praiseworthiness by giving from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. Because in such a system, there can be no sound cost accounting. There can be no intellectual division of labor which allows us to figure out in the first place which needs are particularly pressing and which abilities are particularly effective and particularly capable of being monetized, and so on. So again, in this context, we see that economic reasoning is crucial if we are to engage in sound ethical reasoning. And this is the case precisely on account of the value-free character of economics. If economics were not value-free, then it couldn't be value-relevant all across the board. And I think that the general conclusion that we can draw from the Misesian tradition is that various value-free social sciences, particularly those of so-called nomothetic character, that is, especially those social sciences whose aim is to establish the existence of certain logically necessary laws applying to the realm of human action, are essential or have to be taken into account in a crucial manner whenever we propose any ethical proposals, whenever we make any normative statements that we consider to be implementable, that we consider to be actionable. And we typically understand this point in the context of natural sciences. For example, nobody in his right mind would say that we should create a perpetual motion machine, because creating a perpetual motion machine would enable us to contribute towards the noble ethical goal of eliminating world hunger, because there is no such thing as a perpetual motion machine. There cannot be such a thing as a perpetual motion machine, and physics explains why there cannot be such a thing. And in this sense, a value-free discipline, which is acknowledged as such by practically everyone, is highly value-relevant. And I believe that we can reach a similar conclusion regarding social sciences, and it is particularly the Misesian paradigm, both when it comes to applied economics and when it comes to his economic methodology, that allow us to realize that there is this kind of parallel here between physical sciences or natural sciences and social sciences. In other words, social sciences, first of all, are value-free, or at least should aspire to be value-free, and secondly, it is only on account of them being value-free that they can be value-relevant in a crucial sense. And as such, it is imperative to take them into account whenever we engage in any kind of ethical reasoning that aspires to be practicable, that aspires to be implementable. So in this sense, there is a very essential complementarity between normative social theory or ethics in general and value-free social sciences. And I believe that we owe it to Mises and to the Misesian paradigm that we can fully grasp this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker, Father Dr. Gniadek.
Thank you very much. It's working. Thank you very much. I think I always find myself between a rock and hard place when I have to speak about Mises. Because on the one hand, I have always, you see, Catholics who criticize me, but they have never read the human action. On the other hand, I have, you see, you who follow the Austrian School of Economics, but you are not a theologians. So my position is always, you see, difficult to talk about Mises, and I'm more a theologian, and I'm a priest. Even now, you see, I cannot, you see, hide myself. I wear a Roman collar, so already, you see, I would say, you see, on the one hand, I promote, advocate the idea of the liberty that is explained by the Mises, as I find in human action, and on the other hand, you see, I point out at the ultimate goal because that I had chosen, and that's, I think, is the problem. I don't want you to put upon you see, the ultimate goal that I had chosen, you see, but I cannot speak, you see, as a just lecturer. I speak as a missionary. What I do, you see, with Mises, you see, I don't only, you see, the Mises Institute was founded 15 years ago, that I started reading Mises 30 years ago. And I would like, you see, to tell you what I had been attracted by in what Mises says, because I think that it might help you to understand my position as a Roman Catholic priest who since many years had been advocating, you see, this idea of liberty, as I find. So I would like to point out that 2 points that I think that are important for this topic. This is the Mises utilitarianism, and the second thing is the principle of Weltfreiheit. Because this, for the first part of my speech, I would like, you see, to start from that. This Mises utilitarianism is based on a logic of causal-effectual relations, that is nothing new in the development of economic thought. It was already St. Thomas Aquinas and the late scholastic who used utilitarian arguments to prove natural economic order. Even, you see, very often we, in the social teaching of the church, we say that the beginning of this social teaching of the church begins with Leon the Great, with his encyclical letter, Rerum Novarum, but it is, I would say, from the very beginning already Clement of Alexandria, who explained that goods, the commodities that we find on the market, they have no values in itself. You see that we give them value. So there was already Clement of Alexandria. Later, after St. Thomas Aquinas, we have late scholastics who used this utilitarian argument to prove the natural economic order. So for them, the value of commodity of service resides not so much in their objective value, but in how people value them at the moment of exchange. So this means that the economic value is a result of individual preferences. In the ultimate account, it's always subjective. And Mises' rational utilitarianism does not mean, however, that man aims only at the satisfaction of his material needs, and he is, for him, the ultimate criterion for the evaluation of his action. Mises points out that the goal that the free person might choose might have a metaphysical character. So that means it might be, you see, might be God himself, and it doesn't, you see, disturb us, you see, to you see pursue, you see, the economic life. So methodological, and this is something that I wanted to point out, that this is the person, the free person, that aims and not only aims at the satisfaction of his material needs, what is stressed by Mises. Further, methodological individualism and the subjective theory of value does not allow do not allow us to reduce our thinking about man to the category of a homo economicus. And the concept of negative freedom does not reduce man merely to creative transcendence, but permits him to develop receptive transcendence, open to the truth. So Mises' anthropological assumption, and it's something that from the very beginning when I started, when I read for the first time Human Action, these are the first 200 pages where Mises develops, you see, his anthropological assumptions, and by means of the praxeology approach. So Mises' anthropological assumptions allow us to presume that each man's potential action in laissez-faireism can be morally good act. So that's something what is important for me as a moral theologian, what I discovered, and I've been advocating that the laissez-faireism, the laissez-faire system allows us, you see, it gives us the freedom, the room in which we can every potentially, you see, act might be a morally good act. So man in Mises is free to aim at his goal, and that's the goal that he chooses freely. And morality consists, and this is something that, because I talk as a moral theologian, so morality consists in the rational ordering of the human act to the good in its truth, and the voluntary pursuit of that good known by reason. So we can see that morality involves, you see, the free will, the reason, and the goal that it might be, you see, for me, as I said at the beginning, is the ultimate goal. But there Mises doesn't, you see, describe, doesn't, you see, say what is my goal. I freely choose, you see, the goal that is my ultimate goal of my life. So this is the Mises utilitarianism that is explained, you see, by him, and I don't see any problem as a moral theologian with that, because when it is combined with the subjective theory of value and with the methodological individualism. And the second thing that I would like is, to point out, this is the principle of Wertfreiheit. This is the science free from valuation, and it was for Mises the central point of his praxeological system. When I read for the first time the Human Action, I was attracted by the first 200 pages that where you see Mises puts, you see, his anthropological assumptions, and he says who the acting man, what the human action is about. So according to him, the postulate of Wertfreiheit may be easily fulfilled in praxeology, because it is also applied, praxeology is also applied in other a priori sciences. It's not only that it's reduced only, or we use only it for the economics. So Mises calls praxeology an apolitical science, and when I advocate and when I promote, you see, the Austrian School of Economics as a priest, a moral theologian, I don't intend to make out of the Austrian School of Economics. I don't even try to do that, to make and to think in terms of, let's say that it could be good, you see, to create something like a Christian economics. I don't want. I want, you see, the economics to be to follow this principle of Wertfreiheit, because should be neutral, as Mrs. says. It is in all respects neutral, for it refers only to the means and not to the choice of the ultimate goal. And praxeology is a domain of scientific research that deals with any purposeful human action. And as an example, a good example, I would like to point out at the personalistic norm described by Karol Wojtyła, later John Paul II, in his book Love and Responsibility. And John Paul says, and of course, what we have in the church, we have the commandment of love, but we, by using, the principle of negative freedom, we might, and the praxeology, we might develop, what he did, the personalistic norm, which states that the human person is the kind of good that does not admit of misuse and cannot be treated as an object of use as a such means to an end. So it shows, that this example that the praxeology is not only limited, to the economics. We might use for other sciences, or even in the theology and the ethics. And the praxeology is always neutral because it refers only to the means and not to the choice of the ultimate goal. And that's something why I'm attracted by. I have been attracted by this Austrian School of Economics as a theologian, as a missionary, as a priest, because Mises doesn't say what is. He says one thing, that every human being chooses, a goal that wants, to achieve, and this he applies to the economics. Because to give value to the commodities that we have on the market, we have to have a goal. And the goal is not defined by him, and that's something that we have to, as a free human beings, we have, this room given by the praxeology, by this idea of the free market that is promoted by Mises, and so we can choose freely, and it doesn't matter. I'm Catholic, I'm Protestant, I'm agnostic, or I'm searching for the truth. So for everybody, it's place, it's a room in the world that follows, this principle of a free market, of a free market that implies the word Freiheit. So this is a science that is free from valuation. And so these are the 2 points I wanted to point out that I find interesting in Mises' writings for this topic.
Thank you very much. And now we are going to the second part of our discussion, starting again from Professor Juruś.
Thank you very much. I will stick to these ethical questions and ethical issues, and I will appear as an advocatus diaboli perhaps, but I make some remarks about the Mises' approach to doctrine of natural law, because I think that Mises is, in a sense, incoherent as regards his approach to the doctrine of natural law. Because on the one hand, Mises says that the idea of natural law led eventually to rationalism and utilitarianism. It's a quotation from his theory and history. So it means that according to Mises, the doctrine of natural law is a source of utilitarianism. So leaving aside the question if is so, because I think it's not the case. So in the human action, Mises says that by the teachings of utilitarian philosophy and classical economics have nothing at all to do with the doctrine of natural law. So I think that therefore I said that Mises is in a sense incoherent as regards his approach to the doctrine of natural law. And what else? And sometimes Mises claims that there is something as social social cooperation, we say, which is natural phenomenon. And this social cooperation is, as Mrs. says, in conformity with human nature. So if this is so we must assume that Mrs. assumes that there is something as human nature. And the question, very simple question, is what is the human nature? Is it something objective, or maybe is it something relative? And when Mises refers to the doctrine of human nature, he writes as follows. There is the first idea that the nature-given order of things exists to which man must adjust his action if he wants to succeed. So it seems that, according to Mises, the gap between factual judgments and value judgments in this case disappears, because when we replace the word must by word should, we have the doctrine actually of natural law, that from factual statements, from factual judgments, we can derive value judgments. So, but according to Mises, of course, this statement says nothing about ultimate ends, but about means to the ends, because there's kind of hypothetical imperative in this sentence, because Mises says if he wants to succeed, if he doesn't want to succeed, he doesn't need to conform to this natural order. And for Mises, it's of course obvious that the science of economics or ethics should be value-free, so that we cannot assess any ultimate ends. And he writes as follows: it's neither more nor less rational to aim at riches like Croesus than to aim at poverty like a Buddhist monk. So, in other words, we cannot say that is something rational to be rich or is something irrational to be rich. But it's a relatively safe example. But when we replace, for example, this riches by committing suicide, and we can say that it is neither more nor less rational to commit suicide than not to commit suicide. It's a different story. And I think that should be any method in ethics to argue that, for example, as in Kant, for example, that committing suicide is something irrational. According to Mises, it seems that in the sphere of ethics, I'm confining to the sphere of ethics, I'm not talking about economics, but in the sphere of ethics, we are lost in a sense. But because we cannot argue that something is rational and something is irrational. Everything is on the same level. And the last consequences of this Mises approach to ethics, because I have said I am confining to the ethics, is that there is a split in the human nature. Because as Mises is concerned, Mises claims that there is a realm of factual judgments which could be true or false, and there is a realm of value judgments which cannot be true or false. The factual judgments are rational, and value judgments are emotional. So, in other words, we have the human beings which are split into two separate parts, rational part and emotional part. So, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, here we go. Perhaps I might carry on this subject of Mises versus the question of ethical objectivity and the question of natural law. I also believe that Mises makes an unnecessary concession to ethical subjectivism. He makes an unnecessary transition from economic subjectivism to ethical subjectivism, precisely due to the fact that his recognition of the fact that economic values are subjective is paired and inextricably linked with his parallel recognition that economic laws are not subjective, they are objective. So the whole area of praxeology deals with the task of accomplishing one's subjective goals within the framework of certain objective laws, which have to be respected if this task is to be accomplished. And the more respectful we are of those objective economic laws, which we have to discover in the first place, the more we are capable of actualizing our subjective economic goals. And this observation, which lies at the very foundation of the Misesian paradigm, is coupled with the fact that, again, as my colleague mentioned a moment ago, there is in fact such a thing as objective human nature, and which is a point that is repeatedly stressed by Mises in the methodological parts of his writings. He consistently and repeatedly points out that human beings are categorically and qualitatively different from the rest of the material world, that unlike plants, we are not governed by stimuli, and unlike animals, we are not governed by instinct, or at least not purely by instincts, we can counter them. And the fundamental mode of behavior that is characteristic of human beings is action. And action is volition, will, transformed into agency. In other words, it's a prototypically teleological, intentional, goal-driven, goal-oriented kind of behavior. And that by itself implies that certain objective, logical conditions have to be met if this human goal-orientedness is to be able to fulfill its full potential. So we might agree with Mises that it's a tall order to establish that there exists some universally agreeable or objective ethical goals that should be aimed at, substantive goals, but still it implies that there exist certain objective ethical rights and side constraints, to use the Nozikian language, that have to be respected if human action is to be able to flourish, and if social cooperation is to emerge and assume its ever more advanced qualitative forms. As some of you might know, Mises intended to name his magnum opus, which was finally published under the name Human Action. The original name was Social Cooperation. So in Mises's view, human action and social cooperation are inextricably bound. It might be said that the natural end of human action is social cooperation. That's a unique phenomenon that can emerge exclusively in the context of interhuman relations, and it stands to reason to suggest that by engaging in social cooperation, which is the natural goal of human action, human beings are capable of flourishing. That is, they are capable of fulfilling their potential. They are capable of elevating their intrinsic nature to the most highly developed qualitative state. And in fact, Mises is quite, I would argue that he is quite insistent on this point whenever he, especially when he enters into a kind of a polemical tone, when he engages in an exchange, in an argumentative exchange with his opponents, for example, with those who criticize the Misesian paradigm in economics, or who criticize free economy, entrepreneurial economy in general, by suggesting that it is bound to degenerate into some sort of social Darwinism. And for example, Mises does not dispute that. He says, yes, I agree with that, and I support that. But if you define social Darwinism as the survival of the fittest, then you have to be realized that being fittedness in the human context does not mean engaging in a kind of eliminative competition whereby the physically stronger eliminate the physically weaker, but fitness in the context of human affairs pertains precisely to human ability of engaging in social cooperation, of achieving in a joint fashion the kind of complex goals that would be unattainable in the context of self-sufficient activity, let alone in the kind of activity that is not driven by intentional and purposively thought out goals. Right? And in this sense, human interaction is, and human fitness in the context of human interactions is something qualitatively distinct, in fact, very much distinct from the kind of competition that we observe in the world of nature. In addition, in the context of human affairs, in fact, competition turns out to be the subtlest form of cooperation. That is what the Misesian theorem of economic calculation teaches us, and that's what the Hayekian notion of spontaneous order teaches us. So I believe that Mises displays at many points an implicit sympathy for some kind of conception of natural law, which is hidden implicitly in the Misesian paradigm, and which is hidden implicitly in this conception of praxeology as rooted in a very specific substantive conception of human nature. It is only when Mises discusses ethics implicitly that he reverts to his ethical subjectivism, even though, as I argue, there are some nascent elements of a teleological concept of human flourishing hidden within the praxeological paradigm, which has been very aptly developed by his greatest disciple, Murray Rothbard.
Thank you. And again, the last speaker, Father Dr. Gniadek.
What is rational? Because I like to see what Mises says. Okay, I like what Mises says. You see at the end of his human action. That's what you quoted. You see, that is the goal of the laissez-faireism is not, you see, to become richer, to multiply, you see, the goods. The goal is to be free. To have a freedom of choice. And Mises says, you see, the desire to be rich is not more or less rational than the desire to become poor as a Buddhist monk. And Mises, as I understand, you see, Mises, he says, what is rational? Rational is what I achieve because I had chosen, you see, goal, and I have achieved it.
Yes, it's a functional rationality.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I agree totally.
Yeah, so that's something, you see, and to continue, you see, what I wanted to say, you see, in my first part of my speech about the subjective fear of value, you see, I would like to refer to that once again, because the subjectivity understood in this way, as we have in human action, should be distinguished from ethical subjectivism, which claims that moral truth is subjective and constitutes the product of personal awareness. So the Mises claims that man is in action is guided by his own scale of values. And that's not something you see, as I experience, because what I would say, I put in practice, you see, what Mises teaches about that. You see, when I read for the first time, you see, about this idea of the scale of value, I discovered in myself that I do it every day, not only once forever, that I had chosen, you see, a goal, and I pursue, you see, for this goal. But what I do, you see, every day, you see, the scale of value changes. Of course, you see, as I said, you see, for me, the ultimate goal is God Himself. He is on top, but I would say He is not always on top. Sometimes I put, you see, on top something different. And Mises says that the human person, Mises says Mises always, he never says the human person, he always says individual. But what Mises says individual, I put, you see, the human person, and I discovered, I see, you see, there is no difference for me. So this, the goals of human action are subjective, and that is why every human being has to designate them. You see, that the goal is up to me, you see, to choose, and this is subjective. Is it rational or not? As I said, you see, before, and this, if I achieve the goal that I had chosen, this is my way of pursuing this goal is rational. And what Mises says, that there is nobody from outside might come and to judge and to tell you this is rational or not, because the person who is from outside doesn't know your goal. And I would like you to refer, talking about the subjective theory of value, to once again to John Paul II and to his encyclical letter, Veritatis Splendor. So John Paul shows that the ethics of personalism based on subjectivity does not weaken human action in accord with the objective truth. So in his encyclical letter, John Paul explains that moral action is good not only when the subject of action corresponds with the true good of a person, which is the ultimate goal and the highest good of man, that is God Himself. But there is a second part for an actor to be morally good, that when the person, through his deeds, in a free manner, shapes himself and takes on the form he desires. So there are two things that are involved. On the one hand, we have, you see, the truth, and God Himself, I would say the Ten Commandments, what you see in the book of Deuteronomy, we read, you see, God, He says, see, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil, and you choose. You choose either to follow me or not to follow me, to take this way of my commandments, or you deny and you just, you see, pick up your own way, and that will lead you to death. So that's something, you see, that a good moral action is good when it involves, you see, on the one hand, we have a goal that we choose, that we are free to choose. In that sense, will be morally good from the point of the teaching of the Church, when this is this is God Himself, the Ten Commandments, and that we follow. And on the other hand, God doesn't force us to do it. We have to discover that is my roadmap, that I agree with God, that is what I want to do myself for my salvation, for achieving the goal that I have freely chosen. So man's creativity and his freedom are not expressed in finding a law, but in living through the law written in his heart, that is in his conscience, and when where the bond between man's freedom and God's law is a living seat. So what we see, how I understand Mises. So Mises Mrs. Man, so Mrs. Human person, individual, is guided by his own scale of value and builds it up on the basis of a goal he freely chooses.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for your attention.